Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today we're joined by Anil Karmel. Anil, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm excited to chat with you. But for folks that don't know you, don't know your background or what you're up to, do you mind telling us a bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So the problem that we solve is rooted in personal pain. So we both came out of, as co-founders, the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons program. So I came out of Los Alamos National Laboratory. My co-founder and our chief technology officer came out of Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And we felt this pain of compliance, having to build all this compliance documentation in Word and Excel that was instantly out of date, to becoming CTOs of the NNSA and having to physically sign off and accept risk on behalf of the government for running these systems going, there's got to clearly be a better way. Compliance is not scalable. So decided to leave government and do something about it. And that was the genesis for the platform that we now call RegScale.
Awesome. I know you're a proponent of the concept called RegOps. Do you mind talking about that a bit? What exactly is that? We've heard DevOps, for example. What is RegOps?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the fundamental underlying principles that we brought here to RegScale as a design criteria is looking at what was done in DevOps, right? Where you had developers working on code, they'd go pitch it over to system administrators. System administrators would look at that and then say, okay, you got to go fix X, Y, or Z, hand it back to a developer. Developer would have to go fix it, hand it back over to sysadmin. Sysadmin would have to go then put it in production. Then security would come in and say, no, here's all the security issues you got to go deal with. Go fix all those issues before you can go promote that, so that everyone have to go back. And these individual silos had to work right kind of next to each other, pitching things over the fence, right? So this is where DevOps and then DevSecOps was born, where now we're working in an agile manner, right? Underpinned with an agile manifesto of, hey, here's kind of the way that we should operate. And CICD pipelines were born, and now we're embedding security into the pipeline and the process before code even exits the pipeline, right? But we're still doing compliance after all that's done. So after the code exits the pipeline, now the compliance people are coming and saying, tell me how you've met AC2, tell me how you've met AC5, tell me how you met IA1, right, for NIST controls. Right. And then you got to do it for ISO and PCI and SOX and HIPAA, and the list goes on and on and on. So we're like, look, how can you bring the principles of DevOps to compliance? Right. And that's where the idea and the concept of regulatory operations, or RegOps, was born. Right. Why can't we develop compliance documentation at the speed of code? We can, because the technology has arrived today. The as code movement and the shift left movement now provide us the tools and the vehicles for us to shift left not only security, but also shift left compliance. And thus the fundamental thesis and concept of regulatory operations, underpinned by a compliance manifesto that mirrors the Agile manifesto.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I've been in that position many times using legacy GRC tools and, sending spreadsheets around, asking if it's the right spreadsheet, have you updated this? It's a really painful process. It's a tedious process, and it's really no way to kind of have that continuous monitoring that we're trying to strive for from a compliance perspective. I wanted to ask you, touch a little bit on this on the technology front. How do you think the role of APIs, tool chains, pipelines, cloud, how do you think that's impacted and changed, the way we approach compliance, or what opportunities does it present to us?
It's those four things that make this possible, right? The rise of the API economy, being able to exchange information in real time between systems, the rise of cloud, where everything isn't locked away in a data center, the rise of CI/CD pipelines, where now you can automate the deployment of technology and code, right? Brings together a nexus of capabilities that allow technology solutions like what we built here at RegScale to take those capabilities, bring them together in an API-centric platform to shift compliance left, to where now you can exchange information using APIs between systems, take those issues that come from security tools as mapped to compliance requirements, automate the creation of tickets in your ITIL platforms like ServiceNow, Jira, right? And keep your compliance paperwork evergreen and continuously up to date. This is what the compliance as code movement was striving to do, right? If you think to, and I'll pivot a little bit, security operations centers were born, right, to help folks come together, take security events, address issues, and trying to react quickly to security events when they happen in as near real time as possible. I think the time has come to bring a SOC to compliance, right? Instead of waiting for somebody to come in with a checklist and saying, did you do this? Did you do that? Did you do this? Did you do that? You didn't do that. You better do this. Here's a spreadsheet. Go fill this out. Wait 2 weeks, right? You're not compliant. What if you had the concept of bringing those kind of things that we just talked about, cloud, APIs, CI/CD pipelines, bring it together and have a SOC that could, from a compliance standpoint, to address those issues to ensure you're not just continuously secure, but also continuously compliant.
Yeah, I think you're touching on a lot of things I've been trying to kind of rant and write about lately is like, traditionally compliance has been this snapshot in time assessment. I kind of compare it to like I have kids, right? I check their room, it's clean when I look. But what about in a week? What about in 2 weeks? What about in 6 months? The way we approach compliance is always a snapshot in time. We revisit it, every year, for example. That's no way to keep pace with the environment that we're in, operating in agile DevOps environments, as you mentioned, in cloud. And the promise of the cloud API is we can, evaluate those things in a near real-time fashion. So I think you're getting on some real innovative capabilities. And this is going to be the future of compliance. I think you guys are spot on with this. One thing I wanted to ask you, like we talked about APIs, cloud, tool chains and things like that, a lot of technology promise, but there's a cultural aspect to this too. The workforce is used to the spreadsheets, used to those legacy GRC tools, used to evaluating controls manually, screenshots, shoulder surfing, all the fun things that we do in compliance. Any thoughts on the cultural aspect? How do we kind of adapt the culture and bring that workforce along with us on this new approach to doing compliance?
Excellent question. All of this has happened before. If you remember the DevOps movement, there was a lot of concern from system administrators that went, I'm going to lose my job. I'm not going to be able to be a sysadmin and run these systems. I mean, data point, I was a sysadmin. So at Los Alamos National Laboratory, I was a sysadmin. I ran servers, I racked and stacked servers, right? I literally started and built physical infrastructure, built the infrastructure. I started there, right? So, I say that to say, as you continuously learn and retrain, there's a capability to up-level your skill sets to be able to do things that you thought previously were impossible. That's what can now happen with compliance, where, we're so used to doing compliance the same way in a checklist-driven mentality. Compliance adds value. The rules were created to help put guardrails in place so that you can understand, here are the best practices and things that you should do. The problem is the way that we demonstrate doing them is painful and time consuming and point in time, right? But if you made compliance real time, if you made compliance continuous and complete to where that same person that's checking to ensure that you're actually doing those best practices can now focus on, okay, here are the things I need to manually test. Here's the risk that you're now faced because you are no longer compliant with these controls, which are in essence best practices. You're now a value add to the business. So it is a cultural transformation where you no longer have to just send spreadsheets around. You can produce audit-ready documentation on demand. You can leverage as code to do your job, up-level your skill set, and be of value to the business. That is a cultural transformation. And that's part of why we talk about this regulatory operations or RegOps as a movement, because it is a cultural transformation coupled with technology to allow you to really bring the benefits of what DevOps brought to automation and driving code to production quickly to compliance.
Yeah, I love what you said there about, compliance adding value, because, often people will say, compliance is not security. They kind of bemoan the concept of compliance, but compliance adds guardrails. It ensures that we're doing these fundamental security activities. We have, fundamental processes and policies in place to mitigate some of the most common risks and vulnerabilities, things of that nature. I think it's the way we do compliance that's problematic. And what you're hinting at is the way of doing it now can add that value at a much faster pace that keeps pace with the business, the way we're operating these days. I wanted to ask you, on that front, how does this new paradigm shift? How does it help mitigate some of the most common failures we'll see for organizations when it comes to audits, when it comes to compliance? How does this new approach help alleviate some of those concerns? And how can organizations look at this as a value-added activity, making that cultural transformation shift, investing in this activity?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll tell you, if you're a CISO or you're a CIO, the last words that you want to hear is an audit is about to happen. That's the last thing you want to hear, right? Because now you got to run around, talk to all your people, go find all this paper, prepare for the auditor who's going to come in there with their checklist, say, did you do this? Did you do that? And the auditor, on the flip side of that equation, right? How would you like to be the person to walk into a room and everyone just goes like this the moment you walk in a room, right? That's not fun, right? So back to that cultural transformation side of the equation, how can you change the value equation to where it doesn't feel like the most painful experience you've ever had in your entire life, but it's a value-driven equation to where you are now demonstrating value to the business because you're demonstrating you have put the guardrails in place and you're constantly monitoring them, right? So the value proposition of as code and shift left and brought to compliance and shifting left to compliance is you're always audit ready. Your paperwork is continuously up to date because you're continuously monitoring your controls. It's why we have this push towards a continuous ATO, right? Continuous ATO is continuous monitoring of your controls. The only way you can do that is leveraging an API-driven approach, because now you're tying to those tools that are continuously monitoring your infrastructure, tying them to the controls directly, right? Before the auditor shows up and says, did you do it? You've already created the ticket in Jira or Snow to go address the issue. And when it's closed over there, it's closed and your controls are up to date. So now you can focus on risk, because ultimately that's what's important. Is compliance should just be the table stakes of what you do. It's the guardrails. But if you can now focus on, when the auditor shows up, here's the risk to the enterprise, right? Because you're not compliant in these controls. And then here's the operational risk to the business because of these threats that have come in, the incidents that have occurred, the controls that you're failing, right? And the cost to remediate. You can now have a real conversation around ROI and where to spend your dollars to remediate that risk, drive up your compliance posture, and drive down your risk of security. So no longer is it compliance versus security. You can now have your cake and eat it too.
Yeah, I think you really touched on some great points there. One that you talked about that I think I've run into a lot is we've seen cloud adoption in the public sector and Kubernetes and containers and stuff, is that, auditors, security control assessors, they spend a lot of time tackling these kind of activities around compliance that they don't have a lot of time to upskill around the technology. So it often creates this gap where they're trying to assess a system that they just don't understand often. And I think, kind of removing that friction, that, that issue there of letting the platform assess these controls from a technical perspective alleviates that concern, because now you can get real information. You're not just having an engineer have to take some time out of their sprint to step aside and talk to the auditor, talk to the compliance folk, explain how we're doing things, how we set up the system. You're generating that telemetry in real time through the platform and presenting it to an auditor in a manner that they can understand. And I think that's where the real value is. Something else you've talked about is, you talked about codified documentation, right? And I know your organization is a big proponent and has had some involvement with an effort called OSCAL, Open Security Control Assessment Language, through NIST and FedRAMP and others that have gotten involved there. For those not familiar, what is OSCAL and what exactly is the promise of moving to this codified, documentation format?
Excellent question. And I can tell you, we are such big proponents of this OSCAL movement. The Open Security Controls Assessment Language is, and highly encourage you to go to pages.nist.gov/OSCAL, OSCAL, and learn more about it, right? It allows you to express the intent of what you want to attest to from a security plan perspective, right? Both the plan itself, the assessment, the POAMs, the entire package as code. Right. So as opposed to creating 600-page Word documents, right, that are instantly out of date the moment that you're created, updating them in a point in time and doing a stare and compare exercise to try and figure out what changed, right, and the risk to my system. That's how we do it right now, right? Look at these 2-page documents and figure it out. Let the machines do what the machines do best. So being able to let the machines create that documentation package in OSCAL, right? A JSON object or an XML object, being able to parse that with the machine for the machine to then tell you, here are the controls that you need to go pay attention to based on whatever threat vectors or methodology that matters the most to you, right? As opposed to you trying to figure out, okay, what's the architecture of this system? right? How did they build this thing? Trying to understand how they wrote it. Did they write it right? Did they implement this control? I mean, you have to become like this SME in this system to try and understand how they implemented compliance to then determine, is it secure enough to meet my organization's needs? Which is why it takes so long and it's so painful. Let the machine do what the machine does best. That's where OSCAL and the promise of OSCAL is so exciting, why we have fully embraced the standard, contributed to helping advance the state of the art by baking it into the core of our platform to output all levels of OSCAL in a completely free community edition platform, right? Where you can download it, you can generate your own OSCAL catalogs, profiles, system security plans, system assessment plans, right? Because the promise of a machine readable future is where we are all headed. It's what happened with infrastructure. It's what's going to happen with compliance.
Yeah, you actually touched on something I wanted to emphasize and even ask another follow-up question on is like we've seen this happen with infrastructure as code, compliance and configuration as code, containers, everything is becoming declarative, in a codified format. And OSCAL brings that kind of concept to compliance, which is critical, like you said, for machine readability, automation, efficiency, accuracy, all those kind of things. One thing I've seen is like, compliance folks can look at this concept and they can understand why it's valuable, why it's promising, but they don't want to necessarily learn how to write OSCAL manually, right? How to do these things manually and have to generate that stuff themselves. So how important do you think it is for a platform or a technology to be able to help generate these kind of things in, these artifacts that we need, the SAP, the SARD, SSP, on and on, in these formats that we don't have to try to teach auditors and compliance folks or even take engineers time to write this code manually?
Agreed. I mean, that's the fundamental key is, ultimately, writing code from a compliance standpoint, right? You need to create a platform, right? Where GRC professionals that understand the intent of how compliance should be done can work in a UI or user experience that is easy to understand, easy to use, right? It's why Word and Excel are used, because it's easy to understand, it's easy to use. I can just type in what I need, right? Express the intent of what I need and let the machine do what the machine does best, right? But then let the machine do what the machine does best, where you can have security architects say, hey, I know how this scanner works. I can tie this scanner's API to this platform's API, or just turn that on if it's an enterprise capability, right? To where I just turn on the APIs that I need to map to those security controls that auditor wants, right? So instead of the auditor knocking on your door saying, hey, give me the evidence and the screenshots for how you met AC5, right? Because I need to see that you've actually met that. So show me, right? Because my paper says this. So give me the screenshots that you've logged in and that I meet this control. Let the machine do it, right? Makes a security professional's job so simple in that, okay, I'm just going to script it. Here you go. The GRC professional's job is great because they get that in a format that they can understand because it's in a graphical user interface. Push a button and out comes OSCAL.
Yeah, something else I want to talk to you about, and kind of bring up this. It's almost, I won't say a bad word or mythical unicorn within the realm of public sector agencies and programs when it comes to compliance is the concept of reciprocity, right? Is trusting what someone else has done. And in the traditional way of doing compliance, that will require like going through their paperwork, just trusting what they've written down, what they've said. How do you think reciprocity and that concept changes when I can look at telemetry from the system, from the pipeline, in a codified format, and have those artifacts on demand? Does reciprocity become, more realistic underneath this paradigm? Because as we know, it's often talked about, but it's never really implemented. People tend to redo the work themselves because they don't trust the artifacts or the documentation. How do you think this changes in this new format, this new paradigm?
Trust is two things in my view. Trust is truth plus transparency, right? So, really for trust to be built and reciprocity to happen, you need to be able to say, this is what I'm saying we do. This is why we authorize this plan. And here's how. And here's how we're continuously monitoring those controls, right? So if you're doing that, you can build trust to actually make reciprocity a reality to where you're minimizing the amount of rework that has to happen, yet still understanding, here's a master system security plan. One of the beauties of OSCAL is that it allows inheritance, right? Where you can have a master SSP and have child SSPs inherit controls from the master SSP for those child system security plans that need to have deltas based on the profile of the agency that has the data that they need to secure or protect. So you can still do that, but because you trust that master SSP and the controls that are implemented in that master SSP, because you can see the continuous monitoring of those controls, right? Leveraging API, leveraging cloud, right? Leveraging the as code movement. It makes reciprocity actually real. It's not just paper that's being passed. It's actually showing and demonstrating trust that, hey, you're doing what you say you're doing.
Yeah, I think that part's so critical as we see the push for zero trust and, software supply chain security. We're talking about attestations and, those kind of things. Seeing that telemetry from the system in near real time is so critical to facilitating that trust. So I think you're spot on there. So I wanted to ask, as we look forward, say 3 to 5 years, as an industry, these things take time to shift culture, shift the way we do things. What do you think the future of compliance looks like in these large organizations dealing with these compliance frameworks? And then also, I had a follow-up question. You brought up, HIPAA, SOC 2, FedRAMP, NIST, on and on. Do we have a problem with framework sprawl? And any thoughts on that topic? How do we tackle it? How do we deal with that?
Yeah. So I'll start with the first, which is, what does the future look like? I mean, the future is continuous, where compliance is no longer a paperwork-driven exercise. It is an exercise that allows you to level up your security profile and your security program, right? It's not a either or, it's an and, right? You're shifting left security and compliance, right? It's no longer just DevSecOps, right? Compliance is baked into that, right? That's where RegOps comes in, and it's part of the movement. So you need to be part of the movement of what the future is in terms of compliance. Because if we're still doing compliance in Word docs and Excel spreadsheets, 10 years, if that's how you're doing it, 10 years from now, you're going to get left behind, right? If you're still racking and stacking servers the same way you did in the 2000s, you're going to get left behind. The future is as code. The future is shifting left. There's an opportunity for you to up-level your skill set so that you can be part of that future. Learn, continuously learn and grow, right? This is how we together can ensure the guardrails that have been set are in place, and you can help that organization up-level their security and compliance posture by being part of the RegOps movement. Now, the second part of your question, compliance framework sprawl. Everybody has a framework. Everybody's framework is special because everybody's special, right? All these frameworks came out for all these different industries, right? Because everybody's got to be a little bit different. And that's okay, right? I mean, the problem becomes when you have to do compliance over and over again for all these different compliance frameworks, and you've increased the cost of doing business, right? Where now the questions are you this compliant? Are you that compliant? Are you Z compliant? Are you, and the framework going on and the burden increases, right? It's why the as code movement is so important. Because if you don't have an as code approach, you will never be able to get ahead of the compliance and framework sprawl, right? The reality is these additional frameworks have come into place because they're putting in guardrails and protections and controls for organizations that need them, right? For a particular reason. So it's not ill intent. The intent is actually good. The problem isn't the frameworks. The problem is the way we match and address the frameworks, right? So if we say there's one framework to rule them all, I'm not necessarily sure that's true, because there are different frameworks for different reasons, because everyone is special for a particular reason, and you should be, right? The question is how you demonstrate compliance against those frameworks. If you can do so and reuse evidence in a way that allows you to scale to meet those requirements across multiple standards and frameworks, now there's something.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that one. I like the idea of moving to a code format and being able to kind of map across those frameworks and rationalize them, especially if you're kind of under the purview of multiple frameworks. You need a faster, easier way to do that. Otherwise, you're just going to drown in those manual activities.
Yeah.
So the last question I have for you that we ask every guest is, what does the term cyber resiliency mean to you?
I mean, cyber resiliency, the whole purpose of it is, trying to ensure that you have really fully thought through and built cyber into every aspect of your business and architecture. The problem is, there's always going to be gaps, right? There's always going to be something that you miss. So, so and that's why Zero Trust was born, because, ultimately, if you, trust all these different things, then, you can end up with vectors where, adversaries can attack, with the rise of nation states attacking institutions around the globe, and ransomware, and a variety of different threat actors that are attacking our nation's infrastructure as well as in systems. It's important now more than ever to employ machines to do what machines do best, to refocus people on activities that allow you to increase your cyber resilience and move away from things that are what we typically focus on, which is this checklist mentality, to focus on cyber and compliance resilience, right? To where we're now addressing the risks that matter the most to our mission and our nation.
That's awesome. Awesome perspective. And that said, I want to say thank you for coming on, and thanks for being a proponent of the concept of RegOps, whether we call it RegOps or compliance innovation or whatever we call it. We've seen the push for DevSecOps, shifting security left, but often, that adds friction and slows down delivering value to the organization. And I think unless we shift to this as code format, integrating with APIs, cloud, pipelines and telemetry in near real time, we are not going to see the velocity we want to see, because compliance is always going to be that manual, burdensome activity. So that said, I really appreciate your perspective, and I hope folks learn from the conversation. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.